Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. Right, so it's nearly Christmas time, which means we are closing into finishing up our ranking series. I do these twice a year, in June and in December, and we already have done majority of them. In today's list of rankings, I am going to be going over, well, who I consider, in my personal opinion, the most important champions in Battlegrounds, because I do think it's great to have super fast attacker, I do think it's great to have amazing defender, but if a champion can do both, then it's better, because that helps you draft more confidently, that, you know, makes your drafts more versatile, because you do have more defensive and offensive options. And in general, if I said before that I do not necessarily always include 10 strictly defenders only, because I think it's too much. I don't ever include 10 strictly attackers, because I do think, again, you might have trouble finding good defenders then when you draft. I always include at least like 15 plus dual purpose champions in my decks to make sure that I do have added versatility. What is important about these champions is obviously that they are exceptional defenders and also attackers. They will not always be the toughest defenders to beat, or they will not always be the fastest, you know, offensive champions. But the thing that makes them great is their versatility and how many great matchups they are capable of doing, and obviously also how many great champions they are capable of defending. And here we have the mandatory disclaimer. This is a mixture of my own personal opinion, as long as with the current game relevance and trends. We all do have different playstyles, we do have different experiences, we do have, you know, different results and impressions, and there is no escaping a specific level of subjectivity when I'm creating these lists. I do not use, you know, any database from Kabam. I do not work for Kabam. I don't have official data. This is my impression, my opinion, my view of the game, based on participating in Battlegrounds at the highest levels possible, finishing in either top 10 or top 100 every single season, and also being always towards the top of the leaderboard in betas and so on and so forth. And ultimately, that is how I'm creating these lists. If you disagree with it, I'm not trying to offend your family's history and ancestors. I'm not trying to spark an argument. I do not necessarily disagree if you specifically find, you know, other champions more useful, because it can be so that you have had a completely different experience. Ultimately, I do, however, try to reflect the top tier metagame the best I can. That being said, let's jump to Auntmay and start going through. There are obviously a lot of champions that could easily make this list and were cut just short. There are quite a few champions that we are not quite sure about yet. A great example here would be a champion that I am not including in this list, but I was shortlisting Cersei as one of the possible candidates, because Cersei is an excellent defender, especially when you do not have appropriate counter for her, and she's quite solid as an attacker. But, you know, ultimately I did not include her in this list. Similar thing here, we could be talking about Domino, for instance. The reason why I didn't include Domino would be that she is one of the best defenders, without a doubt, but offensively, her matchups are just unpredictable. They can be extremely hit or miss. So for that reason, I'm not including her on this list. And we could also go into champions like Toad and so on and so forth. There are a ton of potential champions for this list. But that being said, let me get it started with spot number 10, and that is going to go to Scorpion. Now, Scorpion, without a doubt, is primarily an offensive character. I would skew it about 70-30 or so, but the reason why I did include him here is that as a defender, he is extremely potent as well. He's not a defender you will try to drop as your round 1 defender. He's more so a defender that you will use in your round 3, most likely, when your opponent doesn't have a suitable counter remaining. Because he's not the tankiest, and he's not necessarily the hardest champion to fight, but at the same time, he can cause significant problems. I have lost plenty of matches to Scorpions on defense as well myself, because that Scorpion sense does have quite high probability of triggering, and when it does trigger, things can snowball from there, because you do take a burst of damage. Then you have the debuff, which makes you hesitant to throw special attacks. and all of a sudden, you know, the fight can just go very wrong very quickly, and you just lose a whole bunch of health. If everything goes perfect, like with many champions, you can nuke him quickly, and that is the difference of the best defenders. Because the best defenders in this game, you know, there aren't many things that can nuke down Rintrah super quickly. You know, even if you bring in Archangel, it's still going to take you 40, 50 seconds or whatever. And same with Human Torch against the Rintrah, just because of how tanky Rintrah is. Scorpion is not that. If you have a, I don't know, Hitmonkey, you can probably get through a Scorpion in 30 to 50 seconds. But that is why the importance of this dual nature comes into play, because he is extremely versatile offensive option. And you can use him against a ton of champions on offense. And then also, you can drop him on defense in later rounds, and he will 100% get you Ws in Battlegrounds. Therefore, I did feel it appropriate to start off with the Scorpion, because he's a good example of a dual-purpose character that's kind of skewed slightly more offensively, but still have a very good amount of defensive capabilities, and that overall package, in my personal opinion, makes him a staple of Battlegrounds. In fact, every single champion on this list, I'm almost always running in my Battlegrounds deck. So that's the difference between exclusively attackers, for instance. I think Hitmonkey is an amazing offensive champion, but there will be metas when I'm not using him. And there will be times, you know, when you need to make some choices because you just don't have space for that many offensive champions. With these champions, I virtually always hold them in my deck due to their versatility of how many matchups they can cover, both offensively and defensively, and Scorpion definitely fits on that list. Speaking in similar nature, we have Warlock. And Warlock, again, he's not the best or the fastest offensive Battlegrounds champion. And he's also not the best defender. Not even close to it. But at the same time, he is surprisingly painful as a defender, especially if opponent doesn't happen to have like a Hulkling or Hercules or something to deal with him. And, you know, ability to counter him directly, because in between infecting and making opponents' offensive abilities fail, in between putting on shocks or armor breaks on your opponents and therefore causing them to degenerate, lose power and take damage, in between preventing them from critting against Warlock, all of that often combines the fight to where opponent will probably get your Warlock down, even with less than ideal matchup, but they will also more than likely take some damage, and they will more than likely take some time killing this guy, again, unless they do have like a really excellent counter. But he's definitely one of those champions that forces opponent to think about, you know, being able to kill him on defense. And then obviously offensively, he still walks all over majority of the mutants, and not just mutants. He can be used against a wide variety of the champions. One of the favorite things for me is in a pinch to use Warlock against some of the Mystic tanks. For instance, Rintrah, he's capable of dispatching, you know, with pretty much no more than a 5 to 8% chip damage to his own health, but, you know, always very stable and safe offensive option as well. The way he deals with bishops, and again, as I mentioned, Rintrahs and a whole plethora of different champions. And his kind of like offensive potential is greatly boosted by the fact that majority of the people in the Battlegrounds do run the willpower, and that basically supercharges his power control. So absolutely love Warlock for Battlegrounds. He can definitely get you out of a tricky situation, both as a defender, as an attacker, and that is the purpose of this list. So do not underestimate Warlock for Battlegrounds. And speaking of a champion that we already mentioned, Bishop is also, in my personal opinion, one of the more important dual-purpose champions that you always want to kind of have alongside and access to in your deck. Now, the thing with Bishop is that he's not that potent as a defender at the higher tiers. Because once people do get confident and relatively comfortable waiting his level 2, then the only real danger factor fighting Bishop becomes, you know, if he throws his level 1 and you do not have an Incinerate immune, then it kind of gets bad. Additionally, a handy thing that Bishop does have going on for him on defense is the fact that if opponent inflicts, you know, bleed or shock or Incinerate on him, they will be taking a lot of damage, which is a very fun way to kind of trap your opponents, only keeping, you know, specific champions in their hands in round 3. At this point, for high-tier Battlegrounds, Bishop is primarily an attacker, similarly like Scorpion, but the reason why he is as good and as important for Battlegrounds is a fairly unique and interesting case. In my opinion, Bishop exists and functions in as high of a regard as a champion as he does right now is because of how dominant and hard to counter are some specific skill champions. Namely, Kingpin is always or often a very big pain on defense, and Bishop can dispatch of him pretty much better than anybody else. On top of that, we have Korg. He's also excellent champion against Maulman and a handful of other, champs. Then, again, he is more offensively capable than a lot of people do give him credit for, because that, massive burst of level 2 can, finish out fights against a wide variety of champions. He might not be the quickest, but if need be, he can be used for Nick Furies, for a whole bunch of different champions. The one thing that, is kind of annoying with Bishop is that you want to avoid using him against Mystic champions because of MD. If you happen to hold block a bit too long, it can go badly very quickly. But another thing that makes Bishop very interesting is that in majority of the metas, he is surprisingly great counter to dominoes if you do not have one of your primary counters. And that is because he does have increased energy resistance. He has very, very huge increase to his energy resistance. And Domino's crit fail damage is energy damage, so he takes significantly less damage from Domino as well. So ultimately, I think Bishop is a very clear-cut case of a champion being elevated to a higher level than he perhaps otherwise would be due to the conditions in meta. If nobody was running Kingpin, if nobody was running Korg, and so on and so forth in their decks, perhaps, Bishop wouldn't be quote-unquote needed as much. But at the moment, he makes for a guaranteed Battlegrounds staple that's extremely versatile, that answers some of the more annoying and hard matchups in the game, and also functions as, potentially dangerous defender that in ideal situations you can actually manage to trap an opponent and guarantee a victory as well. But he's one of those champions where fight goes slightly wrong, it goes very wrong. And that, in my opinion, puts a lot of value on him. Absolutely love my rank 4. In fact, if I think about it and I look at this list, just as a personal kind of like validation or personal proof of my appreciation of these champions, I believe that every single champion in this list I have taken to rank 4 as a 6-star, and I do not regret it, and they have been extremely effective and helpful. That being said, moving on, spot number 7. And spot number 7 as a dual-purpose champion is going to be Hercules. And the biggest thing about Hercules is that people do criminally underestimate him as a defender in lower tiers, because he's not hard to find. He's not the champion that will get you a KO. And that, matters more at lower tiers. Because in lower tiers, typically people try to find champions that might be harder to fight. But often the problem is that if people know how to fight that champion well, let's say Annihilus or Super Skrull, they go down very quickly. If they have a decent counter, if those, people who are going up against an Annihilus are comfortable fighting Annihilus, those champions are going to get dropped very quickly. In higher tiers, it is more important to stall out your opponent for as long as possible. It is very rarely, comparatively speaking, that you place a defender expecting the defender to KO your opponent. In Celestial 6, Celestial 5, and stuff tiers like of similar nature, you place a defender hoping to stall your opponent as long as possible, not for them to take a ton of damage or get KO'd or any of that stuff. And Hercules is an example of a champion that shines in that specific condition. Now, Hercules is not hard to fight, particularly. Yeah, he does have some annoying abilities, like him going stun immune, can throw some people off. Often ends up with some extra chip damage due to that. His Infuriate is quite frustrating to go up against, making your offensive abilities fail. And that can definitely be annoying. But that's about it. There's not much else going there with Hercules. It's not like hard to evade special attacks. He doesn't go unstoppable. He doesn't evade. But he does stall the opponents extremely well, especially with his immortality triggers. and then combine that with Infuriate, failing opponents' abilities. He works exceptionally well at stalling down opponents, and he's not a champion that you will drop on defense in round 1 and, you know, necessarily expect to win. He's much more of a champion that you will keep in your hand, knowing that the opponent is going to be limited to what champions he can put on defense because you have Hercules. Because Hercules is obviously a very potent and effective offensive champion as well, which we're going to discuss in a second. And then you drop him on later in the match as a defender, knowing that your opponent is going to take a longer time to get the Hercules down than you will whatever opponent's dropping, let's say, in round 3. And then obviously, yes, his offensive value. And his offensive value greatly increases with extra bonus skill. Hercules is a great attacker for an average player, but if you watch MCOC Open Tournament and some of the other footage that we have from the top tier players where they, you know, utilize very quick bursty successions of light intercept, getting Hercules to like 8 charges within the first 15 seconds of the fight, thus, you know, basically doubling his damage output pretty much immediately and then getting level 1. And in that kind of condition, he does also work as one of the more versatile nukes in the champion, because he doesn't particularly rely on any debuffs at all whatsoever. He doesn't necessarily rely on, you know, buffs. They do help, but he can do extremely well without them. Therefore, kind of ironically, you know, Hercules in specific metas can be used to take down a Rintra. He's not going to be the fastest at it, but he can do it due to all of that extra increased damage. And, you know, he can go up against many of the awkward opponents, like Kingpin, for instance, or Bishop and things like that. And then on top of it, obviously, he crushes virtually all of the tech champions, so there is definite value offensively for him as well. And stepping down from that and moving a bit further in the similar direction, we have Galen. Now, I have discussed Galen already as some of the most valuable attacker in the Battlegrounds, and I still stick by it. And he is also quite a troublesome defender, especially in any meta where he gets access to any extra power gain whatsoever. And that is kind of a key with Galen. If you have a champion that, you know, has some power gain effects, or you can outpace Galen in getting to bars of power, you don't particularly have to worry about him entering the harvest as long as you can keep knocking him down with special attacks more frequently than he can keep throwing his special attacks. But any meta where Galen, you know, can get a smidge of extra power, he becomes incredibly much more dangerous. On top of that, Galen is also one of those champions that forces you to play extremely carefully, because if you make a mistake against Galen, he will, you know, punish you and immediately gain extra buffs and virtually immediately enter harvest, and a mistake that, you know, could be very slight or minor will end up taking away half of your health pretty much, or a significant portion of your health. So Galen does have quite a bit of defensive potential. I do think that people are starting to figure out how to work around Galen, but obviously we need to keep in consideration his offensive potential as well. And he's one of those champions that functions very similarly as Hercules. He's not necessarily the best champion to throw down in round 1, but he is a champion that your opponent will have to respect you for just having access to it. Because when opponent plays something on defense, they need to keep in consideration whether Galen can nuke that thing down extremely quickly, and in most cases he can, because he does have one of the most versatile damage delivery methods. And then obviously in rounds 2 and 3, he is a very solid champion to throw on defense that will slow down your opponent or potentially devastate them if they are left without extremely appropriate counter. And that is the beauty of the dual purpose champions. If you draft Galen as your first champion, for instance, in the entire draft, your opponent is forced to not only draft a counter to him, they're also forced to keep in mind that he can nuke down, you know, large amount of defenders, therefore adjust their defensive strategies too. And that's why I think Galen is very effective and powerful. Spot number 5, I think a champion that still somehow gets underrated in the community, especially in Battlegrounds, because Nimrod is much better defender than a lot of people believe him to be. And that typically comes from, obviously, him being tanky in his Blitz protocol, reducing damage from critical hits, And then also from him at any given point in time, reducing the damage he will take from your special attacks, either by inflicting cowardice on you, that's reducing your special attack damage directly, or inflicting power drain debuff on you when you use special attack, thus restricting your access to special attacks and therefore slowing you down. And ultimately, he's one of those champions that's also quite meta dependent, how well he functions as a defender. But again, he does have more than enough defensive capabilities to be able to bring you Ws quite often, especially if opponent doesn't have the perfect counter. And in many cases, even if opponent does have a counter that can take him quite quickly, due to the fact that, you know, he has that power control, he has that cowardice, he has those armor ups, he's quite effective at stalling the fight just about enough for you to have a chance to finish your opponent's fight quicker. And then obviously if you do make a mistake whilst he's throwing level 2, that is going to hurt a lot. On top of it, what helps him out as a defender is the fact that when he throws level 1, he can gain that energize that's extremely potent, and therefore opponent will have to bait out more special attacks, and then it kind of cascades downhill even further, because if he keeps throwing special attacks, then he either keeps getting that energize, or he keeps getting unstoppable, which you are forced to wait out. So he's a very, very potent defender, and people do underestimate that, in my opinion. And then obviously as offensive champion, we already have discussed him, where he just annihilates an entire class of champions, and is also capable of dealing with quite large amount of random casual matchups. You know, maybe not the fastest, but if need be in a pinch, you can use him against Nick Fury, for instance. He's a great Abomination killer, he's a great Eye-Hulk killer, so on and so forth. So there are quite a lot of random champions that he can take down. And obviously, if he does see a mutant, that mutant is just dead immediately. So Nimrod is a Battlegrounds staple. I think, again, has worked in virtually every meta. There have been a couple of metas where he has worked, you know, less effectively, but still one of the more potent champions so far in the history of Battlegrounds for both offense and defense, and an absolute must-have staple, in my opinion, in every deck. Spot number 5, I'm gonna give. Spot number 4, I'm gonna give to Dr. Doom, because Dr. Doom is again one of those champions where you can draft him early. An opponent will have to respect him as a defender. Like if opponent doesn't have a good counter Dr. Doom, then he's dead. just based on the fact of how tanky Dr. Doom is, the fact that most champions will virtually never crit against him. And then obviously all of the chip damage that you can amass against Dr. Doom, all of the slaps that you can potentially face if you are evading his special attacks and he enters Aura of Hazarath. And obviously the more skilled players are better at getting around this champion, and since he's not the tankiest champion, there are times when he can get taken down, you know, relatively quickly. But one of the cooler things about him is that in almost all the fights he provides plenty of, you know, block damage, chip damage, and any mistake against this guy can be potentially lethal. If you make, you know, a slight miscalculation and evade his level 2, you're going to be almost dead. If you end up blocking that level 2 trying to be safe, you're going to lose significant amount of health. If you run at him at the wrong moment, you know, you're going to get slapped after he has nullified your precision. If you misshoot your special attack or heavy attack whilst his aura is still active, you're going to get clapped and slapped. So there are a lot of things that can go wrong when you're fighting Dr. Doom. Therefore, he's definitely potent as a defender. Again, especially when you combine it with his tankiness. And then offensively, let's face it, he's not the fastest champion. You know, there are always better options. But still, there is a plethora of champions that he can take offensively. And most importantly, some of them are the more important champions to have access to. For instance, he is one of the better and safer Korg counters. He can do an equal rank Korg in majority of the metas in about 60 to 70 seconds. But that will also be almost always extremely safe fight, where you are unlikely to lose more than 8% of your max health. And he has great control of the fight. So he's one of the more safe and stable and viable Korg counters. Then champions like Cersei can go down in like 45 seconds or so with you not throwing your level 3s and stuff like that. So ultimately, definitely extremely capable offensive and defensive champion, and his power absolutely cannot be underestimated in Battlegrounds. But now, the top 3. Now it's a big one. Now the big top 3. And I think every single one of these champions on this list has to be or should be in your Battlegrounds deck, and you should be working them and ranking them up. But I think with the top 3 champions, it goes to a different level. With the top 3 champions of this list, if you do not have access to any one of these 3 champions, you are automatically at a huge disadvantage in any kind of like competitive Battleground scenario, in virtually all of the metas. So let's start with spot number 3. Spot number 3 is Rintra. Rintra is one of the tankiest champions in the game. I believe he has top 3 largest health pool in the game. And on top of that, he does have increased energy resistance, increased crit resistance, which means champions will crit less against him. Which means that unless you have basically the perfect counter, he's going to take quite a while to get down. On top of it, there are other defensive abilities, and I don't think I need to explain much in terms of how important Rintra is as a defender, especially since just on defensive merits alone, he did make it to the top 10 defenders of Battlegrounds list. And then obviously there's the whole flip side of Rintra, where he is one of the 3 neutralized champions that we have in the game. I do think that Tiger is obviously the better attacker, but Rintra is still capable of finishing extremely troublesome fights in under 30 seconds if you get lucky with a level 2 crit, or alternatively about 40 to 50 seconds if you have to throw 2 level 2s, which, you know, is still fair enough, and in most cases will be more than fast enough. And again, as we discussed multiple times before, when you do draft Rintra relatively early, you immediately force opponent to look for a champion that can deal with him, because if they don't have a good counter to Rintra, they have lost that round, guaranteed. Rintra is going to survive, they may or may not survive that fight, but he's not going to go down in those 2 minutes. And the coolest thing about Rintra is that if they do have a counter to Rintra that is, you know, exceptionally good, you can just turn around and slap Rintra on attack. And then you can take down Hulklings, you can take down Gallants, you can take down virtually all of the Cosmic Champions. Rintra is one of my favorite null counters, for instance. Great against Terraxes, Cersei's, Omega Sentinels, and a whole bunch of different champions. And again, Neutralize being one of the most valuable abilities in the entire game, let alone Battlegrounds, him being one of the neutralized champions is just such a huge bonus to this champion. Also the fact that virtually nothing in the game, with the mere exception of Scorpion, is immune to Rapture, gives him, you know, quite wide variety of targets to go up against. And then obviously the fact that he's a Mystic champion, and again, he still will be dealing with the buffs and all of that other stuff, helps him tremendously as an offensive option. So I do think he is an absolute must-have, and must-have ranked as high as possible to any player who wants to do well in Battlegrounds. I think if you do not have Rintra, you are in a disadvantage in Battlegrounds, no questions asked. This is one of those champions that, you know, defines the game, alongside, you know, Tigra and Torch and Archangel as attackers. He's one of those champions that decides where the fight, the match, the game is going to go. And Rintra is in top 3. So what's better than that? Well, we can argue whether it's better, and I know a lot of people will disagree, but I gave Kingpin spot number 2. Actually, I was for the longest time claiming that he is the best dual-purpose champion for one very, very big argument. So far, out of every single node combination, Kingpin has been the only champion that has worked well both offensively and defensively. If you don't believe me, go and check back in time. He has worked for all of it. When we had to deal with Power Snack, he was doing just fine. When we had to deal with Masochism, he was doing just fine. When we had to deal with Safeguard, he bypasses that. when we had to deal with Crit Me Was Your Best Shot. He was an absolute savage. And he just have that, again, quality in resume. And I understand that people will still jump at me. Kingpin's great, but not that great. Kingpin's shit, or Kingpin's overrated and stuff like that. And again, I agree. On paper, reading his abilities, he should not be performing as well as he does. He really should not. But hey, guess what? It turns out that in Battlegrounds, he's one of the most dangerous and effective champions, period. He answers a ton of hard fights. As an offensive champion, his ability to get rid of like all the debuffs all the time is extremely potent. The fact that he regens any chip damage taken is super useful. He has access to ability accuracy reduction on your opponent, and degeneration, and unstoppable, and plenty of damage. All of that is enough to make him work almost always, and in a wide variety of scenarios. Need to kill a thing? Sure, go ahead. Need to go and deal with I-Bomb or Man-Thing? Or sure, go ahead. Need to kill a Sasquatch? Why not? You can do that. You can just go ahead and Kingpins. He's not the fastest always. Sometimes he is. If you need to go up against like an I-Bomb or a Null and stuff like that, he can be one of the fastest champions. But in a generic matchup, he won't be. You probably are looking at like 50, 60, 70-second fights in many of the cases. But he does them so well, so controlled, so reliable in virtually all of the metas. And again, I understand his ability description doesn't function as like a true reflection of how good the champion is. His CV does. He works in all the game modes, and definitely he works in Battlegrounds with like virtually all of the nodes. And the cool thing about Kingpin is that he's unexpectedly crazy powerful defender. Yeah, of course, there are champions that can take him down, just like with anybody else, but in general, the reason Kingpin turns out to be as powerful of a defender is the fact that he has, number one, increased combat power rate. So he's going to be getting specials quicker, and you're going to have to bait out more of them. Number two, many of the popular attackers don't really work against him because he shrugs off those debuffs, therefore further increasing his combat power rate. And number three, for a champion who has increased combat power rate, you pretty much never want to bait out a level 2 from him because he goes unstoppable for a really long time, and that wastes a ton of time. And not to mention his level 2 can be a bit tricky to evade, often is unblockable, and just lands you in all sorts of trouble. So again, as soon as there's a tiny bit of increased power gain on top of it, you know, he's crazy defender. But even without that, he can be a real potential problem and force people into timeouts and make them make mistakes. And I have won so many matches. I think Kingpin in general has won me the most matches out of any other champion in Battlegrounds over the course of, you know, their existence so far, as a defender and as an attacker. And up until earlier today, I would have placed him first, and I would have been hated for it. But there is a champion who I think is more important to have, or is performing better at the very least right now in Battlegrounds. And that is Hulkling. I think Hulkling is the best and most important Battlegrounds champion, arguably. Because without a decent counter, Hulkling is, you know, impossible to kill in 2 minutes. In between his regen, in between him gaining a lot of extra power and throwing extra special attacks, and then going indestructible and mitigating your damage, you're just not going to get him down in 2 minutes. With a solid counter, it's going to take time, but can be doable. With great counter, he can be melted as a Cosmo champion with a lot of buffs, yes. But again, the power of Hulkling in Battlegrounds lies in the fact that as soon as you draft a Hulkling, your opponent has to find an answer for him. And as soon as they do, if they do, it is zero effort or sacrifice on your part to just turn around, take a Hulkling, and beat somebody with it, and don't place him on defense. And that is the beauty here. Because Hulkling absolutely eliminates, you know, slates of defenders about as fast as anything. For Battlegrounds level fight, he does have one of the higher damage outputs. I'm not saying he's faster than Tiger or Torch in an appropriate matchup or something like that, but he's very fast. Like very, very, very fast. And also the fact that he absolutely does not rely on placing any debuffs, the fact that he can find his own openings, and he has like the simplest playstyle in the game, makes him extremely versatile and able to cover a ton of matchups. Like if you need to kill a Gallon, sure, go ahead. If you need to kill a Warlock, no problem. If you need to kill a Scorpion, why not? If you need to kill a Kingpin, why not? No problem. You need to kill a Hercules, a Nimrod, all good, go ahead. Obviously, there are matchups that he can't do that great against, but in general, he works, and he works very well, very fast. In fact, in Rich Get Richer meta, I specifically remember thinking to myself, almost every time an opponent had a Hulkling, that I have lost a round. If opponent gets a Hulkling, in my head, it meant almost equal to the point where I have to give up a round, or I will end up giving up a round. Because that is, how fast and dangerous he was in Rich Get Richer meta. But it's not just Rich Get Richer meta. There's a very good reason why I think he's the best champion added to the game, period, this year. And there's a very good reason why I think he, on his own offensive-only merits, is one of the top 10 attackers. And he was very, very close to making it to top 10 defenders list as well. The reason why I didn't include Hulkling and several other champions that could potentially make top 10 defenders list is because most of the Cosmics can almost always be nuked by almost all of the Mystics. And it kind of sounds like it should be, but that is the thing that makes good defenders great. Like for instance, when you look at Korg, Korg does not necessarily get nuked down by all the mutants. Yeah, there will be some mutants that get to nuke him down, but there are plenty of mutants who will struggle or who will take quite a bit of time. If you look at Thing, yeah, there are skilled champions that will nuke Thing down very quickly, like, Massacre and Hitmonkey and Falcon. But then there are plenty of skilled champions that will struggle. But with Cosmic class, we do not really have that. It's like almost all of the offensive Mystic champions will always walk all over almost all of the, if not all of the defensive Cosmic champions. So that's why he didn't quite make the top 10 defender list. But he was very close to it. And ultimately, again, just by sheer amount of effectiveness, and perhaps most importantly, the amount of scenarios where he's effective. I think Hulkling is, at the moment, the most needed Battlegrounds champion. He's definitely, powerhouse in the game mode. No questions asked. So that has been my top 10 list in dual purpose champions. We want to revisit the list here. Now let's take a look at them. We have Hulkling, number 1. Kingpin is number 2. Rintra is number 3. Dr. Doom is number 4. Nimrod, Gallon, Hercules, Bishop, Warlock, Scorpion. All 10 of these, I think, any serious Battlegrounds player should rank up, should hunt, should prioritize in getting, and almost always should put in their decks. Obviously, there will be metas where some of these champions do not work, but in vast majority of the cases, I think all 10 of these can easily be fit in anyone's deck and make it better. They're always in my deck. Or almost always, I should say. Here we are. Let me know whether you agree or disagree with this list. Just before I finish, I'll show you guys my fancy intro yet again, and I'll see you guys later. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about the next